At 11:47 a.m. on February 14, 1944, Staff Sergeant Thomas Edward Kerrigan hung from the bomb bay doors of a burning B-17 Flying Fortress at 19,000 feet over the German city of Brunswick, watching his parachute tumble away into the frozen sky below. 23 years old, ball turret gunner from South Boston, Massachusetts, 0 options left. The parachute had been shredded by the same 20mm cannon shell that had torn open his left leg. He was bleeding badly, the bomber was dying around him, and in approximately 4 minutes, the aircraft would explode. The mission had started badly and gotten worse. The 381st Bombardment Group had launched 21 aircraft from RAF Ridgewell that morning, part of a massive 8th Air Force strike against German aircraft factories. The target was the Mühlenbau und Industrie AG plant, a facility producing components for Focke-Wulf fighters. Intelligence estimated light flak and moderate fighter opposition. Intelligence was wrong. Kerrigan's bomber was named Lucky Patricia after the pilot's girlfriend back in Ohio. First Lieutenant Raymond Driscoll had painted the name himself, borrowing red paint from the ground crew and adding a cartoon pinup girl that the squadron chaplain pretended not to see. The crew had flown 9 missions together without a scratch. They believed in the name. They believed in their luck. The luck ran out over the German border. The first Messerschmitt Bf-10-9s appeared at 10:52 a.m., climbing out of the cloud layer below like sharks rising from deep water. There were at least 30 of them, maybe more, attacking in waves of 4 and 6, concentrating their fire on the low squadron where Lucky Patricia flew. The group's P-47 escort had turned back at the German border, their fuel tanks too small for the deep penetration mission. The bombers were alone. Kerrigan was in the ball turret when the attack began. The Sperry ball turret was a glass and aluminum sphere mounted on the belly of the B-17, cramped and claustrophobic, the most dangerous position on the aircraft. A gunner sat curled in a fetal position, his back to the sky, his twin .50 caliber machine guns pointed at the earth below. He could rotate 360 degrees horizontally and nearly 90 degrees vertically. He could see everything beneath the bomber. He could see nothing above. The ball turret gunner was always the smallest man on the crew. At 5'4" and 130 pounds, Kerrigan fit the position perfectly. He had grown up in the tenements of South Boston, the son of a dockworker father and a seamstress mother. He had lied about his age to enlist at 17, adding 2 years that the recruiting sergeant pretended to believe. He had wanted to be a pilot, but his eyesight was marginal and his education had ended at the 8th grade. The Army Air Forces made him a gunner instead. The first pass killed the tail gunner. Staff Sergeant William Billy Cochran, 20 years old, from Terre Haute, Indiana, took a burst of 20mm cannon fire through the tail section. The shell shattered the plexiglass, tore through his flak jacket, and killed him instantly. His guns fell silent. The intercom crackled with voices asking if he was okay. He did not answer. Kerrigan saw the 109s coming around for another pass. They were attacking from 5 o'clock low, the perfect angle to hit the ball turret, the tail, the waist positions. He swung his guns toward them and pressed the triggers. The twin 50s hammered, the tracers reaching out across the frozen sky. He saw hits spark on the lead fighter's engine cowling. The 109 rolled away, trailing smoke, but another took its place, and another behind that. The second pass hit the number 3 engine. The right inboard engine coughed, shuddered, and began to burn. Flames streamed back along the wing, fed by leaking fuel and hydraulic fluid. Driscoll feathered the propeller and activated the engine fire extinguisher. The flames died, then reignited. The extinguisher had failed. "Fire on 3!" The co-pilot's voice was steady, but Kerrigan could hear the fear underneath. A burning engine was a death sentence. The wing tanks held hundreds of gallons of aviation fuel. If the fire reached them, Lucky Patricia would become a fireball. Driscoll made the call. "We're leaving formation. All gunners keep firing. Navigator, give me a heading for the coast." The B-17 dropped out of the bomber stream, her 3 remaining engines straining to maintain altitude. The German fighters followed. They could smell blood. A wounded bomber, separated from the herd, was easy prey. 2 109s broke off from the main attack and dove toward Lucky Patricia. Kerrigan tracked them through his gun sight. The ball turret's twin 50s had an effective range of 600 yards. The 109s were closing fast. their yellow nose spinners growing larger in his optical sight. He waited. At 400 yards, he opened fire. The lead 109 flew directly into his stream of tracers. Kerrigan saw pieces fly off the fighter's wing, saw the canopy shatter, saw the aircraft begin to tumble. The pilot did not bail out. The fighter fell, spinning until it disappeared into the cloud layer below. But the wingman was still coming. Kerrigan tried to traverse his turret, tried to bring his guns to bear, but the 109 was too fast. The German pilot opened fire at 200 yards. 20mm cannon shells and 7.92mm machine gun rounds raked Lucky Patricia's belly. 3 shells hit the ball turret. The first shell shattered the plexiglass dome above Kerrigan's head, filling the turret with freezing wind and fragments. The second shell struck the turret's rotation mechanism, jamming it in place. The third shell punched through the aluminum skin, ricocheted off the ammunition feed, and tore through Kerrigan's left thigh. The pain was extraordinary. Kerrigan had been hurt before. Broken arm falling off a loading dock at 14, knife wound in a street fight at 16, but nothing like this. The shell fragment had ripped a gash 6 inches long and 2 inches deep, severing muscle and nicking the femoral artery. Blood began to pour from the wound, pooling in the bottom of the turret, steaming in the sub-zero air. He tried to move his guns. The turret was jammed. He tried to call for help. His intercom was dead, the wire severed by the same shell that had wounded him. He was trapped in a frozen metal sphere at 19,000 feet, bleeding to death, unable to communicate with the crew, unable to fight, unable to escape. The ball turret had one exit, a hatch in the floor of the bomber's fuselage, directly above the gunner's head. To escape, Kerrigan would have to rotate the turret until the hatch aligned with the bomber's interior, then climb up through the opening. But the turret wouldn't rotate. The mechanism was destroyed. The hatch was misaligned by at least 40 degrees. He was entombed. If you want to see how a wounded gunner trapped in a jammed turret at 19,000 feet managed to save his entire crew, please hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten stories like this one. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Kerrigan. Above him, Lucky Patricia was dying. The fire on the No. 3 engine had spread to the wing. The fuel tanks had not yet exploded, but it was only a matter of time. Driscoll was fighting the controls, trying to keep the bomber level, trying to coax every mile he could toward the English Channel. The rest of the crew was preparing to bail out. Waist Gunner Sergeant Michael Delacroix discovered Kerrigan's situation. The 22-year-old Cajun from Lafayette, Louisiana, had crawled forward to check on the ball turret after the last attack. He found the turret jammed, the intercom dead, and blood dripping from the seams of the aluminum sphere. He pounded on the turret with his fist. Kerrigan heard the pounding. He pounded back. He was alive. He was trapped, but he was alive. Delacroix ran to the cockpit and reported to Driscoll. The pilot's face went pale. The ball turret could not be opened from inside if the mechanism was jammed. It could only be opened from the outside, using the manual crank located in the bomber's fuselage. But the manual crank took time, 3 to 4 minutes to rotate the turret into alignment. They did not have 3 to 4 minutes. The fire was spreading. The wing was beginning to warp from the heat. Structural failure was imminent. Driscoll estimated they had maybe 5 minutes before the wing collapsed or the fuel tanks exploded, maybe less. "We have to bail out," the co-pilot said. "Now, or we all die." Driscoll looked at the instrument panel, at the fire warning lights, at the fuel gauges. He looked at the crew gathered in the waist section, their parachutes already strapped on, their faces tight with fear. He looked at the ball turret, where Thomas Kerrigan was bleeding to death in a frozen metal coffin. "Start cranking," Driscoll said. "We're not leaving him." The co-pilot stared at him. "Ray, there's no time." "I said start cranking. That's an order." Sergeant Delacroix grabbed the manual crank and began to turn. The mechanism groaned, metal grinding against metal. The turret began to rotate, slowly, agonizingly, slowly. 1 degree, 2 degrees. The fire on the wing was visible through the waist windows now, a river of flame streaming back toward the tail. The navigator, Second Lieutenant Harold Feinstein, a 24-year-old from Brooklyn, was calculating their position. They were still 40 miles from the Dutch coast, 120 miles from England. Even if they made it to the Channel, they would be ditching in winter water. The survival time in the North Sea in February was measured in minutes. 5 minutes to structural failure, Feinstein announced. His voice was clinical, detached. He had learned to separate himself from the numbers. The numbers did not care about Thomas Kerrigan trapped in the ball turret. The numbers only cared about physics. Delacroix cranked faster. His arms burned with the effort. The turret had rotated 15 degrees. It needed to rotate at least 35 more before the hatch would align. At his current pace, that would take another 3 minutes. They did not have 3 minutes. Kerrigan, inside the turret, understood what was happening. He could feel the vibration of the crank through the metal. He could see the angle of his view changing as the turret slowly rotated. He also knew the mathematics. He had been a ball turret gunner for 9 missions. He knew exactly how long it took to crank the turret manually, and he knew the sound of a B-17 burning. He made his decision. The turret had rotated far enough that Kerrigan could now reach the emergency hatch release, a lever that would blow the bottom of the turret off entirely, ejecting the gunner into the slipstream. The release was designed for situations exactly like this: a jammed turret, a dying aircraft, no time for the manual crank. The gunner would fall free, pull his ripcord, and float down to earth or sea, while the bomber continued on without him. There was only one problem. Kerrigan's parachute was destroyed. The same 20mm shell that had wounded his leg had shredded the parachute pack strapped to his chest. The silk canopy was in ribbons. The risers were severed. If he pulled the emergency release, he would fall 19,000 feet with nothing to slow his descent. But if he didn't pull it, the crew would stay with the bomber trying to save him, and the bomber was going to explode. Kerrigan reached for the lever. At 11:51 a.m., Thomas Kerrigan pulled the emergency release lever. The bottom of the ball turret blew away. The slipstream hit him like a freight train, 180 miles per hour of frozen air tearing at his flight suit, ripping the oxygen mask from his face, spinning him out of the shattered turret and into the empty sky. For a single moment, he saw Lucky Patricia above him, the burning wing, the smoke trail, the dark shapes of his crewmates visible through the waste windows. Then the bomber was gone, shrinking into the gray overcast, and Kerrigan was falling. The fall from 19,000 feet takes approximately 2 minutes and 15 seconds. Terminal velocity for a human body in the spread eagle position is roughly 120 miles per hour. In the fetal position, it approaches 200. Kerrigan did not know these numbers. He knew only that he was tumbling through frozen clouds, that his leg was on fire with pain, that the altimeter on his wrist was unwinding like a broken clock. He did not scream. There was no point in screaming. The wind would have torn the sound from his throat before it reached his own ears. Instead, he focused on stabilizing his fall, spreading his arms and legs, trying to control his tumble the way he had been taught in training. The instructors had called it HALO technique, high altitude, low opening, but Halo assumed you had a parachute to open. The clouds swallowed him at 14,000 feet. The world became gray and wet and cold. Ice crystals formed on his goggles, on his exposed skin, on the blood still seeping from his leg wound. He could see nothing, feel nothing, except the wind and the cold, and the knowledge that the ground was rushing toward him at 2 miles per minute. He thought about South Boston. He thought about his mother's kitchen, the smell of bread baking on Saturday mornings. He thought about his father coming home from the docks, exhausted, smelling of fish and salt water, but always with a penny in his pocket for Tommy. He thought about Mary Catherine Shaughnessy, who had kissed him behind the church after his first communion and then never spoken to him again. He wondered if she would come to his funeral. He wondered if there would be enough of him left to bury. At 8,000 feet, he broke through the bottom of the cloud layer. Germany spread out beneath him, green and brown patchwork fields, dark forests, the silver ribbon of a river, the clustered rooftops of a small town, beautiful and peaceful, as if there were no war at all, as if young men were not dying in the sky above it. Kerrigan had perhaps 90 seconds left to live. He saw the haystack at 3,000 feet. It was enormous. A winter haystack, built tall and steep to shed snow, standing in a field on the outskirts of a farm. From 3,000 feet, it looked like a brown gold pyramid, maybe 40 feet across at the base, at least 25 feet high. Kerrigan had grown up in the city. He had never worked a farm, never handled hay, never thought about haystacks at all. But he understood, in the rushing seconds of his fall, what the haystack might offer. Hay compresses. Hay absorbs impact. Hay had saved the lives of acrobats and stuntmen who fell from trapezes and high platforms. Kerrigan did not know if it could save a man falling from 19,000 feet. He did not know if anything could, but the haystack was his only chance. He shifted his body, angling toward the brown gold target, trying to aim himself like a bomb. The ground was rushing up now, details sharpening, individual trees, fence posts, a farmer's cart abandoned at the edge of a field. The haystack grew larger in his vision, larger, larger. At 11:53 a.m., Thomas Kerrigan hit the haystack at approximately 115 miles per hour. The impact drove the consciousness from his body. The hay compressed beneath him, absorbing his velocity in a chaos of dust and stalks and scattered debris. He punched through the top of the stack, through the packed layers beneath, through what felt like an eternity of crushing resistance. His body twisted, tumbled, folded. Something cracked in his ribs, something tore in his shoulder, and then suddenly, impossibly, he stopped. He was inside the haystack, buried, unable to move, unable to see, packed tight in a cocoon of hay and dust and the copper taste of blood. But he was not dead. His heart was beating. His lungs were pulling air, thin and chaff-filled, but air nonetheless. He tried to move his arms. His right arm responded. His left did not. For a long moment, Kerrigan simply breathed. He listened to his own heartbeat, felt the pain radiating from a dozen different points in his body, and understood that he had just survived something that should have been impossible. The haystack had saved him. A pile of dried grass, stacked by some German farmer for his winter cattle, had caught an American gunner falling from the sky. He began to dig. It took him nearly 30 minutes to claw his way out of the haystack. His left arm was broken in 2 places. 3 ribs were cracked. His left leg, already wounded by the 20mm shell, had been further damaged in the impact. The gash torn wider, the bleeding renewed. He emerged from the hay covered in dust and blood and chaff, looking less like a human being than like some creature born from the earth itself. The farmer found him sitting at the base of the haystack, trying to fashion a tourniquet from his belt. The man was old, perhaps 60, with weathered hands and a face that showed neither surprise nor fear. He looked at Kerrigan. He looked at the destroyed haystack, the scattered hay, the blood staining the frozen ground. He said something in German that Kerrigan did not understand. Then he went to get the authorities. Kerrigan was captured within the hour. A Wehrmacht patrol, summoned by the farmer, found him still sitting by the haystack, too injured to run, too exhausted to resist. They were professional, even respectful. Word of his fall had already spread, carried by farmers who had seen the parachuteless gunner tumbling from the clouds. One of the German soldiers, a young corporal with passable English, asked him how he had survived. "I have no idea," Kerrigan said. "I was aiming for the haystack." The corporal stared at him. "You aimed for it? From how high?" "About 19,000 feet. The corporal translated this for his companions. They looked at Kerrigan with something approaching awe. One of them shook his head slowly, said something in German. The corporal translated, "He says you are either the luckiest man in the world, or God has plans for you." Kerrigan thought about Lucky Patricia, about the fire on the wing, about the crew he had left behind. He thought about pulling the lever, about choosing to fall rather than let his friends die trying to save him. "Ask him," he said, "if my crew made it out." The Germans did not know. They put Kerrigan in a truck and drove him to a field hospital, where a doctor who had trained in Vienna set his broken arm and stitched his wounds and shook his head in disbelief at the x-rays. 3 cracked ribs, 2 fractures in the left arm, a dislocated shoulder, deep lacerations to both legs, and a concussion. By all medical understanding, Kerrigan should have been dead. The fall alone should have killed him. The impact should have killed him. The blood loss should have killed him. "You should not be alive," the doctor told him in heavily accented English. "The human body cannot survive such a fall." "Tell that to the haystack," Kerrigan said. He spent 2 weeks in the German hospital before being transferred to Stalag Luft 4, a prisoner of war camp near Gross-Teichau in occupied Poland. The camp held primarily American and British airmen, bomber crews, fighter pilots, the survivors of the air war over Europe. Kerrigan arrived on a stretcher, still unable to walk, and was carried into the barracks by men who had heard the story of his fall. The story had preceded him. In a world where every prisoner had a tale of survival, of burning aircraft, and failed parachutes and desperate escapes, Kerrigan's jump had achieved legendary status. Men came to his bunk to shake his hand, to ask him questions, to simply look at the man who had fallen from the sky and lived. The camp doctor, a captured British flight surgeon named Major Edwin Halford, examined him twice a week and muttered about medical impossibilities. It was at Stalag Luft 4 that Kerrigan learned what had happened to Lucky Patricia. The news came from a newly captured bombardier, Second Lieutenant James Whitaker, who had been shot down 3 weeks after Kerrigan's fall. Whitaker had been with the 381 bombardment group. He had known the crew of Lucky Patricia, and he knew what had happened after Kerrigan had jumped. The crew had bailed out, all of them. Driscoll, the pilot, had ordered the evacuation the moment he saw Kerrigan fall from the turret. The co-pilot, the navigator, the bombardier, the radio operator, the waist gunners, the top turret gunner, 8 men in total, had jumped from the burning bomber within 60 seconds of Kerrigan's leap. Lucky Patricia had exploded less than 2 minutes later, the fuel tanks finally detonating at 16,000 feet, scattering wreckage across 10 square miles of German countryside. 8 men, 8 parachutes, 8 survivors. Driscoll and 3 others had been captured and sent to Stalag Luft first near Barth. The co-pilot and navigator had evaded capture for 3 weeks before being picked up near the Dutch border. The 2 waist gunners, including Delacroix, had managed to contact the Belgian resistance and were being smuggled toward Spain. All of them had made it out because Kerrigan had jumped. "They talk about you," Whitaker told him. "Driscoll especially. He says you saved their lives. He says if you hadn't pulled that lever, they would have stayed with the aircraft trying to crank that turret. They would have died on that bomber." Kerrigan lay in his bunk, staring at the wooden slats above him, and said nothing. He had not thought of himself as saving anyone. He had thought only of the mathematics, the burning wing, the time remaining, the certainty that his crewmates would die trying to rescue him from a jammed turret. The jump had not felt like heroism. It had felt like the only logical choice. "There's something else," Whitaker said. "The group put you in for the Medal of Honor. Driscoll wrote the recommendation himself. He said what you did, jumping without a parachute so your crew could escape, was the bravest thing he ever saw." The Medal of Honor, the nation's highest award for valor, given to men who had charged machine gun nests, who had thrown themselves on grenades, who had died saving their comrades, not to ball turret gunners from South Boston who had survived by falling into haystacks. Kerrigan shook his head. "I didn't do anything brave," he said. "I just didn't want them to die for me." The recommendation was denied. The awards board in Washington determined that Kerrigan's actions, while remarkable, did not meet the criteria for the Medal of Honor. There had been no direct engagement with the enemy. There had been no aggressive combat action. There had been only a man falling from the sky, hoping to land on something soft. He received the Distinguished Flying Cross instead. The citation praised his extraordinary courage and presence of mind in evacuating the aircraft to ensure his crewmates could escape. It made no mention of the haystack. It made no mention of the fact that Thomas Kerrigan had fallen 19,000 feet without a parachute and lived. Kerrigan remained at Stalag Luft 4 until February 1945, when the advancing Soviet army forced the Germans to evacuate the camp. He survived the infamous Black March, a brutal 86-day forced march through the frozen German winter, during which hundreds of Allied prisoners died of exposure, starvation, and exhaustion. He weighed 97 pounds when American forces liberated him near Bitterfeld in April 1945. He returned to South Boston in June 1945, arriving at South Station on a Tuesday morning, carrying a duffel bag that held everything he owned. His mother wept when she saw him. His father, the dock worker, stood silent for a long moment, then embraced his son for the first time since Tommy had been a small child. Mary Catherine Shaughnessy was not there. She had married a 4F accountant from Dorchester in 1943. Kerrigan never flew again. The Army Air Forces offered him a position as an instructor at a gunnery school in Texas, but he declined. He told the recruiting officer that he had spent enough time in the sky. He did not mention the dreams, the falling dreams, the endless tumbling through gray clouds, the ground rushing up to meet him. The dreams would continue for the rest of his life. He took a job at the Charlestown Navy Yard, working as a rigger, the same job his father had held for 30 years. He married Eleanor Mahoney, a nurse he met at a veterans' dance in 1946. They had 4 children, 3 boys and a girl. He coached Little League Baseball, served on the parish council at St. Augustine's, and never once told his children about the jump. When they asked about his war service, he said only that he had been a gunner on a bomber, that he had been shot down, that he had spent time as a prisoner. He did not mention falling 19,000 feet into a haystack. He did not mention choosing to die so his friends could live. Raymond Driscoll visited him once, in 1952. The former pilot, now a commercial airline captain flying routes between Boston and Chicago, tracked Kerrigan down through the Veterans Administration. They met at a bar in South Boston, 2 men in their 30s who looked a decade older, and drank beer in the afternoon while the February snow fell outside. "I never thanked you," Driscoll said, "for what you did. You don't have to thank me. Tommy, you jumped out of an airplane without a parachute. You did it so we could get out, so we could live. How can I not thank you for that?" Kerrigan stared at his beer, at the foam settling on the surface, at the scratched wood of the bar. He thought about Lucky Patricia burning, about the mathematics of falling, about the haystack that had saved his life by some combination of physics and luck and the grace of whatever God watched over falling men. "You would have done the same thing," he said. Driscoll shook his head. "I don't know if I would have. I don't know if anyone would have. That's what made it brave, Tommy. You didn't know you'd survive. You thought you were going to die, and you jumped anyway." Kerrigan finished his beer. "I didn't think about it that way," he said. "I just knew the math. The turret was jammed. The bomber was burning. If I stayed, everyone died. If I jumped, maybe they made it out." He shrugged. It wasn't courage. It was arithmetic. They finished their drinks and shook hands and promised to stay in touch. They did not stay in touch. Driscoll returned to his life in the air, flying passengers between cities, while Kerrigan returned to his life on the ground, working at the Navy Yard, raising his children, trying not to dream about falling. Thomas Edward Kerrigan died on March 8, 1987, at the age of 66. Lung cancer, the doctor said, probably caused by the asbestos at the Navy Yard rather than anything from the war. He was buried at the Massachusetts National Cemetery in Bourne, his Distinguished Flying Cross in a box at his wife Eleanor's house, his story largely forgotten by a world that had moved on to other wars, other heroes. The haystack farmer never knew what happened to the American he found bleeding in his field. The haystack itself was rebuilt that same winter, 1944, to feed the cattle that had survived the war's disruptions. It stands no more. The field has been paved over, part of an industrial park, on the outskirts of what is now called Brunswick, Germany. No marker commemorates the spot where Thomas Kerrigan fell 19,000 feet and lived. His crew survived the war. All 8 of them. Driscoll flew 32 more missions after his liberation from Stalag Luft 1, earning the Distinguished Flying Cross twice over. Delacroix made it to Spain and was back in England by June 1944, in time to fly again on D-Day. Feinstein, the navigator, became a mathematics professor at Brooklyn College, where he occasionally told his students about the ball turret gunner who had understood the equations of sacrifice. Michael Delacroix tracked Kerrigan down in 1976, more than 30 years after the war. The former waist gunner, now a grandfather living in Baton Rouge, had spent months searching for the man who had given him the chance to escape the burning bomber. He found Kerrigan working in his garden in South Boston, planting tomatoes, his hands still strong despite the arthritis. "I came to say thank you," Delacroix said. Kerrigan looked at the man standing at his fence, at the gray hair and the lined face, at the Louisiana accent still thick after all those years. He remembered the young Cajun cranking the turret mechanism, remembered the vibration through the metal, remembered making the choice that had sent him tumbling into the sky. "You're Delacroix," Kerrigan said. "You were trying to get me out." "I was. We all were." Kerrigan nodded slowly. He wiped his hands on his trousers, walked to the fence, and extended his right hand. Delacroix took it. They stood there for a moment, 2 old men holding hands across a garden fence, connected by something that had happened 32 years earlier in the frozen sky over Germany. "You made it out," Kerrigan said. "Because of you." "No." Kerrigan shook his head. "Because you were cranking that handle. Because Driscoll wouldn't leave. Because the whole crew stayed when they should have jumped. "I didn't save anyone. The crew saved the crew. I just got out of the way." It was the closest Thomas Kerrigan ever came to accepting credit for what he had done. He refused interviews from historians and journalists who occasionally discovered his story. He declined invitations to veterans' reunions. He never visited the Air Force Museum, where a section on ball turret gunners included a brief mention of his fall. He simply lived his life, raised his family, and tried to forget the morning when he had chosen to die so that others might live. The final irony is this: of all the crew of Lucky Patricia, Thomas Kerrigan lived the longest. The man who should have died at 23, who should have shattered on German soil like the bomber that carried him, outlived every other man on that aircraft. Driscoll died in 1981 of a heart attack. Delacroix followed in 1983. Feinstein passed in 1985. One by one, the men whose lives Kerrigan had saved preceded him into whatever waits beyond. He once told Eleanor, late at night, after one of the falling dreams had woken him sweating in the dark, that he sometimes felt guilty for surviving. "I was the one who was supposed to die," he said. "That's what the jump was for. I was trading my life for theirs, but somehow I'm still here and they're all gone." Eleanor held her husband of 40 years and told him what she had told him many times before: that surviving was not a thing to feel guilty for, that the miracle of the haystack was not a mistake to be apologized for, that he had been given a gift and he had used it to live well and love fully. Kerrigan nodded, as he always did, and in the darkness, he dreamed again of falling. If you want to hear more forgotten stories from the Second World War, please subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next one, and if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. These men are gone now, their stories fading with them. The least we can do is remember. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.